Mere months after the release of Soul Reaver 2 in late 2001, in early 2002, Blood Omen 2 was released. These two games were developed concurrently by separate teams, which explains the rather short period of time fans of the series had to wait for the continuation of the story, which I will once more be playing on the PC. As you launch the game, you are served with developer splash screens and the first cutscene of the game. This cutscene is not narrated, and we must only interpret the imagery of the video. It seems like after Kain's decision to refuse the sacrifice at the Pillars of Nosgoth, he gathered around other vampires and waged a war to conquer the world. Eventually, his campaign reaches a city called Meridian, where the vampire forces are confronted by a new enemy with which Kain duels and loses. After the cutscene, we see the main menu, which is less visually appealing than the menu in Soul Reaver 2, but ultimately very functional. In the menu, you can change some graphics options, including resolution, frame rate, and so on. The sound menu, once more, is rather lacking, but does at the very least have two channels now, allowing for the player to set separate volume levels for music and everything else. The control setup is basically identical to that of Soul Reaver 2, and you can once more choose between different control devices and then map controls to whichever buttons you wish, with some exceptions, such as being unable to move the control functions from the analog sticks if using a controller. Yes, the vast majority of people are unlikely to even want to do that, but it would still be nice to have as many customization options as possible. Starting the game works as you'd expect. Click Start Game and you can choose to start a new game, which then leads you to another cutscene. Now Kain awakens somewhere, feeling like his memories are fragmented, knowing what and who he is, but remembering very little of his own past. He's greeted by an unfamiliar vampire who has a, let's say, very 2000s design to her. She calls herself Uma and explains that she and her compatriots weren't sure if you'd ever awaken. According to her, Kain has been in torpor for 2 centuries after his defeat in the hands of his enemy. She shows Kain the world that Nosgoth has turned into during these centuries, and begins to explain more about the state of the world and your past. Kain was indeed leading an army in the pursuit of complete world domination, but was defeated by the newly reformed Sarafan. These new Sarafan were led by a powerful general, only known as the Sarafan Lord, and this is the person whose blade was the cause of Kain's defeat and long slumber. According to Uma, the Sarafan have been able to defeat the vampires and wage a campaign of extermination by using a new type of magic that is powerful against the vampires, called glyph magic, something players of Soul Reaver may have some familiarity with. After the defeat of Kain's armies, the Sarafan took over the entirety of Nosgoth under the guise of protecting the world from the vampire menace. But their rule has not been particularly kind, even to the humans, who are basically enslaved under the iron hand of the Sarafan Lord. How the world of Nosgoth has changed during the long torpor is immediately shown by the state of the city you're in, as the medieval style of the villages in Blood Omen have now been replaced with a more early industrial style, giving the city of Meridian its own distinctive look. You're also told that there are vampires working for the Sarafan, more concerned about their own survival, for now, than that of the survival of their species. This obviously does not particularly please Kain.
Vampires in service to the Sarafan? Are they mad?
Uma explains she is a part of a vampire resistance called the Cabal, and they wish to recruit Kain as their agent to have some hope of defeating the Sarafan once and for all. Since Kain is believed to be dead, and could thus wander into places the Cabal cannot, as to everyone he is unknown, while the Cabal are not. Kain, unsure of her motivations, does have some reservations.
I seem to remember that I played the pawn once before. It ended badly.
But the hunger for vengeance and power is motivation enough. If playing along with her and this Cabal will get him to become strong again and reach his goal of becoming the undisputed ruler of Nosgoth, then perhaps it is worth it. After this cutscene begins the tutorial. As the game changes from the pre-rendered cutscene into the game engine, you hear Uma's disembodied voice, as she explains to you that the vampires have an innate ability called the Whisper, which can be used to talk into the minds of other vampires, but cannot be used to read minds. This is a decent enough explanation for having basically a radio system for the main characters in a game that's more medieval than modern. The very beginning of the tutorial immediately shows how different from Soul Reaver 2 Blood Omen 2 is, since in this game the movement controls are very different. To move Kain, you use the analog stick. Pressing forwards moves you forwards, pressing back has you backstep, and pressing left or right turns you. In other words, Blood Omen 2 implements a tank-style control scheme. For someone playing through this game in sequence, this could be a difficult thing to adjust to, but it is functional. There is one massive positive, however, as Blood Omen 2 finally has almost free camera controls bound to the right analog stick, including looking up and down. The only curious part about this is that the left and right movement is limited by the orientation of Kain and gives you an approximately 180-degree area within which the camera can be moved around in. Moving further down the alley you found yourself in introduces you to another change, as you walk over your first checkpoint. The save system of the series has changed quite a bit across the games, and this is no exception. This time the save system is kind of a combination of the systems of the two previous games. Saving the game can be done from the pause menu and can be used basically whenever you want to, but as in Soul Reaver, loading that save doesn't return you to the specific point you saved in. Neither does it return you to the very beginning of the game either, but to the last checkpoint you activated. Considering the nature of the game, which will become more clear later, this kind of a save system does make sense, and I find it an acceptable solution. Especially since the save system had to work on multiple different platforms, including those that had very limited save space on memory cards. The save descriptions as well are thus far the best in the series, as not only does each save tell you which area you're in, but also the percentage of that area that you've completed, and the exact time and date on which the save was made. One issue with the save system, however, is when you have a large quantity of saves, 50 of which is the maximum, as the display only shows a few of them at the time, starting from the oldest instead of the newest, and the menu sound effect for moving the list is moderately annoying. The user interface of Blood Omen 2 is rather minimal, which I appreciate. The only noticeable part of it is in the top left corner, where you have a circular symbol, 1 bar, and 2 vials, one of which is your current health. Further down the alley, your progress is impeded, and Uma speaks to you once more, explaining how you can jump to traverse the landscape. This time there are no special features to jumping, and you merely press jump to jump, and that's it. As you reach the rooftop, Uma tells you that you can press and hold a jump to quietly float to the ground, similarly to how Raziel can use his wings in the Soul Reaver games. Except this isn't as much a traversal method as it is a way to be stealthy. On the rooftops, you also find out that Kain is still very much a lovable, edgy boy.
She would discover I needed little training in how to kill.
Next parts of the tutorial explain how to use the action button to interact with objects, such as switches to manipulate the environment, or other objects such as doors. For the player's convenience, these objects are highlighted if they are usable, meaning you don't have to wonder whether something is usable or not, as the game very clearly tells you if they are. A little bit further ahead, you are taught another returning feature, feeding, the first time of which is done with a person chained to a wall, which I think is a nice little homage to the first Blood Omen, including some of the sound effects they make.
Please, help me, kind sir!
This works in a very similar way to using the action button. You go near something you can feed off of, and press and hold the feed button. There is one change to this, and one addition, when compared to Blood Omen. Enemies do not have a stun state per se, but instead they can be struck down and fed from later. A massive change from Blood Omen, where you had to take care so you would even be able to feed. This change is likely to be explained by the addition to the system. Now feeding increases what Uma calls your vampiric lore. This is basically an experience system for the game, and filling your lore meter increases the length of your health vial, which is demonstrated rather swiftly after the existence of this system is revealed to you. In my opinion, this is rather well done, immediately giving the player a reason to try and fill the lore bar as much as possible from the very beginning moments of the game. The lore bar is the second file in your user interface. Immediately outside this area, you find another victim for your bloodlust, who acts as another great way to show how features work to the player, as feeding from this helpless citizen does practically nothing to increase your lore bar, showing that being a homicidal maniac isn't necessarily worth it. Next, Uma teaches the player more about the features of the world and vampirism. As has been the case in every game in the series, in Blood Omen 2 as well, water is deadly to vampires and should be avoided at all costs. While not immediately deadly, unless completely immersed, the damage does accumulate quickly and can result in death. If you do die, however, you are returned to the last checkpoint which you activated. She also shows you a vampire relic, explaining that these chests are useless to humans and can only be opened by vampires, who can then tap into the power inside. In practice, these are collectible treasures which increase your experience bar, making it easier to level up your blood vial. Having another one of these relics very close by is, in my opinion, a great way of teaching the player that exploring the areas carefully can be a very good idea. Not only that, but there is a benefit to exploring, which was not the case in Soul Reaver 2. Further down the docks, you catch your first glimpse of a Sarafan warrior. Azuma explains to you how their crusade to exterminate the vampires includes these green ward gates, powered by the Sarafan glyph magic. These gates are impassable to vampires, so you must find another way around it. And so, you enter the best thing in every game, the sewers, which makes several appearances in the game. In here, Uma teaches you about some of the basic combat controls of the game, which has some similarities to the combat in Soul Reaver 2. As you engage in combat, you need to enter auto face mode, which locks you onto a target and allows you to strafe around them. The first thing she teaches you is blocking, which is rather simple if you're using the assisted blocking mode, as is default. You merely keep the autoface mode on and hold the block button. This causes Kain to defend against incoming attacks. There is also an advanced mode which requires the player to time the blocks. After this, you're prompted to attack, which is done by pressing the action button while locked onto an enemy. Then we get a feature which was absent from Soul Reaver 2 but existed in Soul Reaver, as Kain can grab enemies and throw them, or attack and throw them if you press forwards and attack at the same time. You can also dodge by pressing the jump button while locked onto an enemy, but Uma does not teach this to you. It does, however, not seem to work that well against the enemies you're fighting at this point, leading to blocking being your primary means of defending yourself. Having completed her rather intrusive tutorial, you can continue and try this in practice with an enemy that may or may not fight back, as they are felled very easily. If you do decide to follow the tutorial prompts, however, the game teaches you about the horizontal bar in your user interface, as this is your focus bar, which fills up during combat. Once full, you can use a combat-oriented ability if you have one equipped. These abilities are denoted by the circular icon in the user interface and can be changed by opening a ring menu, which allows you to swap between the unlocked abilities. Defeating this enemy allows you to feed and also demonstrates another returning feature, as you can pick up the weapon dropped by this enemy. In the next area, Uma teaches you about the dark gifts of each vampire, explaining that vampirism manifests in each individual differently, and every vampire acquires different powers as they grow older and more powerful. Yours have been weakened as you've been dormant for centuries, but you still retain the ability to turn into mist form, even if in this game you can only transform in certain very well telegraphed areas. The mist form also serves a very different purpose than it did in Blood Omen, and instead of being a traversal method, it plays into the stealth system of the game. While in the mist form, you are practically invisible to the humans, which allows you to sneak behind them, and when a skull icon appears above the enemy, you can press the action button to perform a stealth kill, which plays an execution animation that differs depending on which weapon you're currently equipped with. Going even further, Uma explains to you that after the rise of the Sarafan Order, they spread out their glyph magic technology across the world, and you are shown a junction box, which Uma tells you to activate. She also tells you that this glyph technology is maintained by a secretive order called the Glyph Rates, but that not much else is known about them. Activating the junction box causes a somewhat slow pulse of glyph energy to traverse towards a switch. And once the pulse reaches its endpoint, the entire wire lights up and the switch becomes operative, allowing you to open the gate that blocks your progress. After this, Uma tells you that you should continue through the slums and find your way to a bridge in the east where she will rendezvous with you again. In this area, the game also introduces another type of collectible chest, using which causes a surge of energy to imbue itself onto whatever weapon you currently have equipped. This is basically a damage boost power-up, which lasts until you change weapons or it breaks. The next segment is a set piece which has you take advantage of all the game mechanics you've learned so far without being handheld through the entire experience. You can also stop and listen to some of the locals, since in this game the humans are not immediately afraid of you despite your pale and imposing appearance. After all, in this somewhat dystopian world, they are likely used to seeing sexy goth bad boys who smell good. Hence, the game has a feature which hasn't really been a thing in the series since the first Blood Omen. And some humans have small tidbits to say which add to the lore of the world.
You see that? Have you seen what it can do? It will bring light and heat and no cost for oil or coal. And they bring it right down to the poorer quarters for us simple folk to use. Bless the Seraphim and all their doings, that's what I say, for sharing their magic with the poor.
As you complete this test sequence, the story begins to move forwards, as Uma intends to take you to the leader of the Cabal who wishes to talk to you. But you two are separated as a Seraphim recognizes her as a vampire and immediately turns on the ward gate before you have the opportunity to pass. She tells you to go to the smuggler's den, from where you can find vampire sympathizers who can guide you further. Kain, pondering whether to follow her instructions or carve his own path, decides that he shall find this Cabal, and after finding out what they have to say, he will then have more information on which to base his decision. This denotes the ending of the primary tutorial, and considering how many pages I have in this script just talking about it, you can see how girthy it is. Unlike the tutorials in the Soul Reaver games, or even the first Blood Omen, this one is the most like a tutorial, as you're funneled through a very linear pathway from one lesson to another, each of which stops you and has Uma act as your teacher, explaining in length every single feature that you're expected to learn to play the game. I am not the biggest fan of these kinds of tutorials, as you may have noticed from the earlier videos, where I've praised the games whenever they've taken a more organic approach to teaching the player. Even in Soul Reaver 2, where the initial tutorial is extremely linear, you can completely disable the tutorial pop-ups, and it does not make the game any more difficult to play, as the entire game has been thought around the concept of the player having the capacity to learn the features themselves, especially if they've looked at the manual and read about the controls of the game. Still, this is not the worst tutorial. At least it's not pausing the game with a pop-up that has the developer explaining things to you in a way that isn't written in an in-universe way, so it could be far worse, as at least here each portion of the tutorial also adds to the lore of the universe, which makes the tutorial much less of a chore to play through. After ending up alone, the game also introduces another returning feature, as you're required to move around blocks. This is more clunky than it was in Soul Reaver, as you can only drag the blocks forwards and backwards, so placing these blocks where you want to can take a bit of works. You also cannot roll the blocks, which was a feature also removed in Soul Reaver 2. The function of the blocks, however, is rather good, as they can be used not only as a way to reach higher platforms, where your regular jump is unable to reach, but they can be used in puzzles to block moving environmental objects. While rather simplistic, I do love how it's used to add a little bit more depth to the environmental exploration and puzzle solving. Further down the path, you meet an informant who reveals more information about the world. He's a human who is willingly working for the vampires, as not everyone is happy about the state of the world, seeing the rule of the Seraphim as oppressive, and believing the vampires are the only viable force to fight against the iron fist of the Seraphim. This informant also reveals to you that he was promised the dark gift of vampirism if he serves the Cabal well, and asks Kain to tell them he did just so. Unfortunately for this helpful human, as Kain leaves for the next area, a figure that has been stalking you in the shadows jumps out and kills him. The Den is the first zone where the game gives you a longer area and expects you to put together everything you've learned to proceed forwards, while also expanding on the concepts you've been taught before. This I actually find a rather good game design, and it works well in my opinion. As you wander forwards, you eventually encounter another human informant at a tavern, who gives you directions towards the next area, before your conversation is interrupted by the tavern keeper calling the Sarafan guards to your location. This initiates the main portion of this area, as you go through the zone solving puzzles and fighting new enemies while trying to reach the Sanctuary of the Cabal. Here you'll also notice several ways in which the game builds upon the already existing features. For example, in the tutorial you were taught how the stealth system of the game works, as you were able to use the mist form in designated areas to insta-kill enemies. Now, however, this feature gets expanded upon as a human guard closes a gate you need to pass through every time he sees you. This can be bypassed by opening the gate and entering the mist form before the guard sees you, which allows you to walk through the gate unobstructed. In the same area, there's another similar addition, but this time the people closing the gate cannot be reached, nor is there a misty area you could use to stealth past the gate. Instead, you need to use switches in the environment to activate a deadly stream of steam that causes the guards to meet a very uncomfortable looking demise. As much as I dislike the very straightforward style of the tutorial, I do appreciate how afterwards the game changes rather significantly and actually leans more into the organic learning style that I've praised several times before. Instead of directly saying, do this, do that, the game merely shows you the problem, such as, this person is closing the gate every time you come into view, but it is left up to you to notice the fog and then use it to your advantage. This might seem like a little thing, but to me it matters a lot. Even Soul Reaver 2 kinda faltered on this point by using the camera to focus on the solution more often than it focused on the problem, basically giving the player the solution instead of letting them come up with it themselves, even when the solution was simple. I much prefer this kind of an approach to adding puzzle complexity to video games. You also encounter new types of enemies as you finally have to fight the Sarafan face to face. While the basic combat system remains the same, the Sarafan do add some complexity to the fighting. Previously, while fighting the lowly criminals of the city, it was easy to just block every single attack they make and then counter either with the regular attacks or with the one special attack that's unlocked from the very beginning of the game. The Sarafan, however, do not make it quite as easy for you, as they have two additional types of attacks, which are denoted by different animations and a glow around their weapon. These attacks are similar to the heavy attacks of the enemies in Soul Reaver 2, but with one change, as now there are two separate types of heavy attacks. The first one of them glows yellow. This is a powerful attack which can be blocked, but will break your block and cause a knockback, which makes countering the attack more difficult, as if you do block, you will not be in a good position to immediately strike back at your enemy. The second one glows red, and these ones cannot be blocked, but instead have to be dodged. Finally, it makes sense why the game has a dodge system, as trying to use the dodge on the regular attacks of the enemies rarely works, but with these two types of power attacks that have a slight charge time before they are executed, the dodge function becomes an extremely powerful tool in your arsenal, allowing you to avoid damage while putting yourself in a position where it's easy to strike back at an enemy and deal a lot of damage before they have the opportunity to begin blocking your attacks again. I really appreciate this, even if I do think that the power attack system could have been introduced a little bit earlier, since at the beginning of the game it's very easy to lull yourself into the belief that dodging attacks is absolutely useless. Reaching the end of the area, you find yourself trapped within a large room and are confronted by the figure that has been stalking you. He is called Faustus, an old acquaintance of Kain who was also seen during the introduction segment of the game. Even though you once fought side by side against the Sarafan, he has now decided that self-preservation is much more important to him, and was very willing to strike you down in service of himself.
In serving the Sarafan, I have protection, I have power, and who better to hunt down a vampire than a more powerful vampire?
This leads to the first boss battle of the game, another feature which was completely absent in Soul Reaver 2. The first portion of the fight is very straightforward and requires you to take advantage of the combat moves you learned so far, as Faustus can also do unblockable but rather well telegraphed attacks, which can easily spell the demise of Kain. Once enough damage is dealt, the fight moves on to the next phase, in which you are unable to strike at Faustus directly. Instead, he uses his ability to jump incredible distances to move between humongous furnaces that are littered on the sides of the room. Here, the boss fight changes to a style more reminiscent of Soul Reaver, where instead of being able to directly kill the boss, you need to take advantage of the environment to actually do damage to your foe. In this instance, the furnaces are the obvious means to deal damage to a vampire, but Faustus jumps to another one every time you get too close. Thankfully, there are fields of fog on the floor, allowing you to use the mist form to hide yourself and quickly walk to the furnace controls and damage your opponent. This is yet another feature of the game that I actually appreciate, as the transition between the different styles of boss battle adds a nice amount of depth into the fights, which to me makes them a little bit more interesting. Once you've defeated the first traitor, the game introduces to you one of the most important features of the game, as you drain the life essence of your foe. Draining the essence of Faustus unlocks something deep inside Kain, and he learns the ability to jump large distances. This is extremely similar to Soul Reaver, where one of the main features was feasting on the souls of your brothers, which would then unlock new physical abilities for Raziel. Another feature lacking from Soul Reaver 2, and I kind of appreciate that they brought that back for this game. After all, we are now playing as younger Kain, and one who has been in torpor for 2 centuries. So it's nice to have a feature that not only allows you to learn new vampiric abilities, which can be used to better explore the world, but also to deal damage to your opponents. Not only that, in the context of the world, this to me makes more sense as a means of learning new abilities than finding tarot cards lying around on the floor. At this point, you've been introduced to most of the basic functionalities of the game, and as usual, I will be spoiling the story very heavily as the video continues. So if the premise or the gameplay have seemed interesting enough, now would be a good point to pause the video and go play the game. As has been the case with the series so far, at the time of writing this script, the game is still available for purchase on the PC, and is likely to work right out of the gate. There's also a mod available which aims to increase compatibility with modern computers, so getting the game to work should not be too difficult to achieve. Immediately after the boss fight, you enter an area where the game teaches you how to use the new ability you've acquired. The jump ability has now been added to your ability menu, and selecting it allows you to enter a jump mode by pressing the Dark Gift button. In the jump mode, you can move a targeting cursor in the game world, which changes color depending on what you can do with it. By default, it is white, which means it's not in an appropriate place for a jump, and it turns purple if you can jump to the designated location. It can also be used to attack your enemies, but for the most part the usefulness of this feature is very situational. At this point, one aspect of the game should be pretty clear. The game is extremely linear, and focuses mostly on self-contained set pieces with challenges which you need to overcome. These can come in the form of platforming, combat, and puzzles, often all 3 combined to some extent. This alone I don't see as a bad thing. After all, I do love Soul Reaver 2, and that game is also linear and has shed all forms of exploration, which were a key point of the first 2 games in the series. I can understand why people would take more umbrage at this feature in this game, however, since unlike Soul Reaver 2, Blood Omen 2 doesn't even attempt to hide the fact that it is a very linear game. As not only are the set pieces you go through very constrained, the game is also split into chapters. In addition to that, Blood Omen 2 makes the linearity of the progression exceedingly clear by having small story beats happen somewhat frequently, each of which is required to be triggered in a certain order or the game will not allow you to progress.
Restricted area. This passage is for night shift workers only.
I am the night shift.
If you tell that fool Duncan you work for Duckett's Traders, he'll let you through the gate to the workers' area.
I work for Duckett's Traders. Now, let me through.
I understand why they did this, since it does serve a very clearly defined purpose in the storytelling of the game, as you are wading through a world with which both you and Kain are unfamiliar with, so having these story beats does add to both the character and the player learning about the state of the world and how secretive the vampire resistance has to be, and how they've managed to gain support from the human population, many of which are understandably fearful of them.
Another one. That's what, the 3rd?
That we know of. You still so sure there's no vampires in the city?
There's no saying what we can be sure of anymore.
But it does have very obvious negatives as well. Since the game is already very clearly linear, adding this kind of a progression system makes that linearity much more obvious to the player and can negatively affect the ability to immerse yourself in the game. Personally, I don't find it that big of an issue, but can understand why it would be a feature of the game that would not be particularly appealing to all people. Going through more of the set pieces, which once more add more complexity to the puzzles, you're also introduced to a new type of enemy, a Sarafan guard with a magical armor that begins to glow as you walk near them. As it does, they immediately realize that a vampire is nearby and alerts the guards. This is rather brilliant, as up to this point you've been taught how easy it is to avoid enemies and stealth kill them if you have access to a foggy area. But having an enemy type that can sense your presence without seeing you adds a new layer of complexity to how you have to progress through the game. This game segment also teaches you another new feature: alarms. Once an area has an alarm turned on, they can be turned off by finding the switch for the alarm system and activating it. And the game makes it very clear why you would want to do that, by technically blocking your progression until you disable the alarm. In this area, the alarm switch is right next to a guard station door, which is next to a wheel that can be used to slowly open a gateway that blocks your progress. This is a key point in how the game teaches the player to turn off the alarm, or avoid having them be triggered in the first place, as until it is turned off, the guard station door keeps spawning enemies, which can prevent you from opening the gate. While I'm not the biggest fan of infinitely spawning enemies or unkillable enemies in video games, I still have to commend how this rather simple set piece acts as a way to intuitively teach the player the importance of the alarm systems. Deeper within the city, you find a courtyard littered with mutilated corpses and soon notice the perpetrator of this wasteful display of blood. Another vampire who clearly recognizes you and holds a clear animosity towards our anti-hero. This vampire traitor revels in the thought of finally silencing Kain, but says it's not yet time for your confrontation and runs away rather quickly. While Kain still doesn't know who this vampire is, he is certain of one thing.
You're a sloppy butcher, vampire.
Soon after this meeting, you finally reach your destination, the Sanctuary of the Vampire Cabal, where several vampires await you. One of those being Vorador, the ancient vampire with whom Kain had previous dealings with during the events of Blood Omen. For fans of the series, this could be a controversial moment, as due to the change in timeline seen in Blood Omen, Vorador was seen executed by Mobius and his band of vampire hunters. So shouldn't he be dead? To that, the answer is not necessarily. The timelines of the Legacy of Kain series are, to put it mildly, somewhat muddy. Despite its name, Blood Omen 2 is not a direct sequel to Blood Omen, but in fact is a prequel set after the events of Soul Reaver 2. If this sounds confusing, well, it's because it is. The strangeness of the timelines began with Blood Omen, which technically shows us 3 different timelines, albeit briefly. The first timeline is only shown in the introduction segment, with an event that repeats itself during all of the known timelines in the franchise. The moment when Vorador assaults the Sarafan fortress, slaying several members of the Circle of Nine. In the introduction, we also see the time manipulations of Mobius, which result in the second timeline, starting with the murder of Ariel, which corrupts the Circle, and as a result, the Pillars of Nosgoth. This is the timeline where most of the gameplay of Blood Omen takes place, until Kain is thrown into the past with a time-streaming device Mobius made sure he would have in his possession. Here, Kain creates another timeline by slaying the Nemesis, a warring invader king, before he became the Nemesis and was still known as William the Just. This event caused the entire timeline to change, and the world of Nosgoth to be a very different one once Kain returned to his original time, but in a different timeline. This change created a fervor within the people of Nosgoth, and a massive crusade against the vampires was born, causing the near extinction of the entire species, leaving Kain as the final surviving vampire. This is also the timeline in which the events of Soul Reaver take place, where we see the results of the creation of this timeline and Kain's refusal to sacrifice himself at the Pillars to restore them, which would have doomed vampires to their extinction. In Soul Reaver 2, even more timelines are created, each with the differing amounts of changes that are caused. First of the new timelines begins relatively early on in the game, as Raziel resists slaying Kain with a Soul Reaver, an event which was destined to happen at that specific point in time. At that point, Kain also explained that history would reshuffle events whenever a change happens to ensure that certain eventualities would still happen. The next time a new timeline is created is at the very end of Soul Reaver 2, where Kain rips the Soul Reaver from Raziel's chest, preventing his soul from inhabiting the sword, as was also destined. This, however, was such a massive change in events, as the Soul Reaver is an extremely pivotal part of basically every major event in Nosgoth's history, that history had to reshuffle things even more. We see some of this as Kain becomes visibly frightened by all the new memories that rush into his mind during the ending cutscene, and his anxious cries to Raziel.
Behind Kain's eyes, I could see new memories blooming and dying as history labored to reshuffle itself around this monumental obstruction. And I could see by the dawning horror on his face that perhaps we had strained history too far this time.
The events of Blood Omen 2 take place in this timeline, which was created by Kain and Raziel twice resisting their destinies. Is it confusing? Absolutely. But does it actually contradict the already established lore? Not really, as the entire basis for this timeline's existence was well established and telegraphed during the events of Soul Reaver 2, and the gravity of the changes was made exceedingly clear during the ending cutscene, even if details of those changes were left intentionally untold. Vorador explains that the situation for vampires is dire, and the constantly growing Sarafan forces are threatening the entire existence of the vampire race. Kain questions why Vorador would not just create more vampires to fight this war against the Sarafan, and why should he put himself at risk to help the Cabal, which reveals to us a little bit of lore concerning the vampires of Nosgoth.
Make more of our kind.
It takes time and energy to create a vampire. I have not the strength. No.
This is an interesting change to the common vampire lore, where a simple bite is often enough to transform someone into a vampire, and explains quite well why your victims in the past remained dead, and why it took the vampire empire of Kain millennia to gather enough troops to dominate the entire world. Your meeting is soon interrupted by a wounded vampire rushing into the sanctuary, who exclaims that their reconnaissance mission with Uma was partially a success, as she found something within the industrial quarter of the city, but they were discovered. And before being able to relay the information, Uma was captured, and this vampire was barely able to escape with his life. Now Vorador has a task for you. Save Uma before she is publicly executed, as the information she has may be the difference between victory and extinction. Vorador also knows someone who could help you with this task, the Bishop of Meridian, whose faith is not nearly as strong as his desire for eternal life, but who lives in a quarter of the city which is practically inaccessible for vampires. Kain, being who he is, has slightly differing priorities from Vorador, but is willing to take part in this mission.
Forgive me for it.
We need her information.
We need to save her life, Kain.
Yes, of course.
Why Kain is the perfect person for this task is also explained. As explained before, in the universe of Nosgoth, vampires exhibit their dark gift in different ways, and one of Kain's powers ever since the first game has been the ability to blend in with the human population. And so, you leave the sanctuary and begin the next chapter of the game, where you're immediately in your nobleman disguise. How does this affect the actual gameplay? Well, not much, to be honest. For the most part, the disguise acts as a narrative device to give you an explanation to why you specifically need to tackle this mission. Yes, some of the people have banter, which they say when you get near them, and the regular guards ignore you unless you initiate combat in the first area. In most areas, that has already been the case. Soon you also meet another vampire traitor called Marcus, this time one whom Kain recognizes. It is made clear that the two vampires once held a sort of rivalry, while having an uneasy truce during the war Kain waged against Nosgoth, until something happened, and Kain attempted to have Marcus killed.
Will you sour this reunion with old grudges? Granted, we parted on poor terms.
You tried to murder me?
I seem to have failed.
Marcus admits he's working for the Sarafan Lord and explains he's much more powerful now than when you last met, as he intends to use his power of mind control to subjugate you and parade you in front of the Sarafan Lord. He tries and fails. However, even if Marcus's plan was foiled by the strong mind of Kain, he was able to extract information and now knows of your plan, intending to ensure that you will be unable to complete it by killing the bishop whom you are intending to meet. While rather simple, I do like this setup. Not only does it introduce yet another foe, it adds a level of tension to the story, as now the already precarious plan has become even more unlikely to succeed, leaving the player questioning how the story might unfold. The rest of the chapter involves you attempting to find a way to reach the bishop's home, as you solve puzzles and fight against even more Sarafan guards, until you finally reach your destination, where the Sarafan led by Marcus are mercilessly slaughtering the bishop's servants. This part is a rather good way to demonstrate the ruthless nature of the Sarafan rule, as anyone suspected to be against them is either killed or imprisoned. World building such as this is a rather common sight in Blood Omen 2, and to me is a fantastic way of displaying to the player the completely new world we're now in. The bishop, however, has managed to escape, and your journey takes you to a cathedral where you finally meet him. Unfortunately, Marcus has reached him first, and is mind-controlling the bishop, leaving him unable to speak. This leads to another boss fight which differs slightly from the previous one, but still uses a similar template, as the first phase has you take advantage of the environment and the next your unlocked vampiric abilities. Finally, you defeat your foe, unlock yet another ability, and gain the bishop's help, who takes you to the Sarafan Keep, where Uma is kept waiting for her execution. As at this point has become routine, the beginning of the new chapter immediately puts you into a situation where you're required to use your newly learned ability to proceed. It is very traditional game design, but there's a reason why it's such a trope, because it works well in familiarizing the player with new features. The rest of the stage follows the pattern set by the game so far, and you eventually reach the top of the Sarafan Keep, where Uma is being held. As you free her, your escape is halted by the Sarafan Lord himself, looking very much like a human, and in no way has a suspiciously alien look to him. He seems surprised to see you alive, yet is in no way concerned about this fact. This confidence is bolstered by the fact that the Sarafan Lord is now wielding the Soul Reaver and is able to easily repel an attempt from Kain to attack him. Before being able to vanquish the two vampires, however, Uma uses her gift to teleport herself and Kain back into the vampire sanctuary. In the sanctuary, Uma explains that within the industrial quarter, she had located a strange device that was keeping open a portal within which she saw creatures of the like she had never seen before. Not only that, the device was powered by the Nexus Stone.
Of course. What is this thing? Explain.
The Nexus Stone is a powerful artifact capable of bending time and space, and was the key to the Sarafan Lord's victory over Kain, as the one who holds the stone is immune to the magical effects of the Soul Reaver. This piece of information strengthens Kain's resolve, and he's very much motivated not only by the drive to create his empire, but by good old-fashioned revenge. As such, he agrees to go into the industrial quarter to recover this artifact, with one condition.
When I recover it, I will also claim ownership of it. I trust that is understood.
Progressing through the industrial quarter, you eventually reach the Nexus Stone, connected to the strange machinery that it powers, and have to face against another of the vampire traitors, the same one you met before and chased. This time, however, Kain recognizes him as Sebastian, a member of his war effort and the one who betrayed him, arranging the ambush which spelled out Kain's defeat. But alas, he's no match for the player who's already learned the process with which the boss battles of the game have been built around, and succumbs to the environmental hazards of the battle arena. Despite being struck down, Sebastian still gloats at Kain, explaining that he will die happy, knowing that Kain has no chance to survive Make Your Time, as the Sarafan Lord is in possession of an ancient machine that will spell out the demise of the vampires who oppose him.
Where is the device? Where under the earth?
It lies beneath Meridian. Seek for it if you will. I die happy in the knowledge that all your efforts will be wasted.
As Kain pries the Nexus Stone from its housing, the machine begins to self-destruct, and Kain is enveloped in the explosion. This is not much of a cliffhanger, however, but acts as an excuse to use a time transition, as you find yourself back in the Vampire Sanctuary with the explanation that the explosion threw Kain out of the factory, and one of Vorador's vampire minions brought him back into the safety of the sanctuary. Despite now being in possession of the Nexus Stone, it is not yet time to face the Sarafan Lord. The existence of a doomsday machine is unsettling, to say the least, and Vorador has little to say about the device, but believes that a seer who lives in the wilderness might have the answers you seek, and so your next task is to find her. Moving through the wilderness, you begin to encounter a new type of enemy, strange demon-like beings that prey on travelers who dare to venture between the settlements. These prove to be little danger to our vampire protagonist, as despite their monstrous appearance, fighting them works basically identically to every other fight you've engaged in thus far, and you manage to reach the witch's abode. She looks slightly different and isn't exactly like any vampire you've seen before. However, she does have the information you seek, and as the Sarafan Lord begins to burn down the building you're in, she teleports you to the entrance of the Doomsday Machine. Here, a monstrous being confronts you and asks you for your help. This being has been connected to the machine for centuries, feeding its life force into the device, and is more than willing to help you destroy the machine that enslaves it. To do so, however, you need to gain the blood from the builder of the machine, who after all these millennia is still alive in a prison where time is meaningless, as the core of the machine is a telepathic being, which one might say is very much allergic to the blood of the ancients. You do so and return, delving deeper into the bowels of this complex, where the glyph wraiths are revealed to be beings from another world, or as the beast called them, Hilden. At the very bottom of the complex, you find the writhing mass that the device is feeding, and destroy it as instructed. But as you return to the surface, a surprising sight awaits you. The grotesque beast is no more, but has been replaced with a blue-winged creature. He introduces himself as Janus Ordren, the legendary vampire. Here we also find out, likely the most important part of the entire game, as he explains how the Hilden have managed to invade Nosgoth. As mentioned in Soul Reaver 2, the ancient vampires were at one time at war with other entities. These were the Hilden. Eventually, the ancient vampires were able to banish the entire Hilden population into another dimension and erected the Pillars of Nosgoth to forever hold them back. However, one of the Hilden was able to break through and begin a long plan which would allow him to bring back his entire race, finally wipe out all of the vampires and take over Nosgoth as they had wanted to do many a millennia ago. This was possible as the pillars were corrupted and never healed, as Kain refused to sacrifice himself for that purpose. Kain begins to ponder whether this entire predicament is his fault, but decides against it, since he knows that every step he had taken that led to the moment at the pillars had been orchestrated by others, who may have well known what the end result of their machinations would be. Janus explains that the Sarafan Lord had used his influence to build a portal between the dimensions, and using this portal he had brought in other Hilden to aid in his cause. However, the portal has not been powerful enough to initiate a full-scale invasion, and as such, he has had to act slow. He implores that destroying the portal should be your first priority, as doing so would cut the connection the Hilden have with Nosgoth, and would effectively kill every Hilden that remains on Nosgoth. If this is not done, however, the Sarafan Lord would be able to bring back more and more Hilden until eventually they could take over the world without much resistance. Now, with the legendary vampire at your side, and a new clear purpose in mind, it is finally time to begin preparations for a final assault against the Sarafan Lord. So you inform Vorador and the rest of the Cabal of these new turns of events, and set your sights on the keep of the Sarafan Lord, which has been built on a faraway island, unreachable by any other means than boats, since the entire island is magically protected. As you reach the wharf, Uma confronts Kain and steals the Nexus Stone from him, explaining that she does not for one moment believe that Kain would allow the rest of the vampires live if he were to be given the power of the Soul Reaver once more, since Kain still desires his empire and the other vampires would merely be threats, and so she intends to take care of the Sarafan Lord herself. Quite soon, though, you encounter her again, as her plan has not gone quite as she expected. As you find her close to death, she pleads for her life, and Kain shows his lovable empathy we've all come to appreciate.
Kain, I'm dying.
Yes, you are.
However, despite her pleas, Kain does not save her life. Having been betrayed quite a few times during his unlife, that is one transgression he's unwilling to forgive, even if he has some regrets that things had to go this way.
You could have been my queen.
Kain.
Now, you have left me alone.
Now with the Nexus Stone back in his possession, Kain travels to the island keep where he's immediately confronted by the Sarafan Lord himself, now unmasked, displaying his Hilden features openly. He tries to strike Kain down but is unable to do so, as the Nexus Stone repels the Soul Reaver. However, he is not discouraged by this, and before teleporting away, taunts Kain by proclaiming how despite his doomsday machine lying in ruins, his army of beings stronger than anything this world has ever seen is preparing to travel through the gate and conquer Nosgoth for the Hilden. The island itself is a curious mix of technology and magic, with some Giger-esque visuals scattered here and there. An interesting bit of lore concerning the island is how apparently the Hilden brought humans as slaves onto the island so long ago that their offspring only know of the outside world from the legends passed on by their ancestors. As you explore the island, you manage to disable the magical defenses of the island, allowing the rest of the vampires to teleport onto the island to assist with the eradication of the Hilden. However, the main task of closing the portal through which the Sarafan Lord intends to bring his forces and defeating the Lord himself still remain the responsibility of Kain. This final confrontation between Kain and the Sarafan Lord takes place above the portal, in a scene somewhat reminiscent of the final battle in GoldenEye. During this battle, Kain tosses the Nexus Stone into the portal, which starts a chain reaction that will eventually collapse the portal. Soon, Janus Audron arrives to assist Kain so he can recover the Soul Reaver, but is thrown into the portal to suffer a fate similar to the Hilden, whom the forces of Janus once banished into the demonic realm from which they are now trying to escape from. With a sword in hand, Kain quickly defeats the Sarafan Lord, who still takes a moment to gloat about how the one benefit to being banished into the realm of the demons is that their race is now effectively immortal, implying that rules of life and death work in a different way in that dimension. However, that does not help him now, as Kain impales the Hilden and as he leaves, shows he's a cool guy because he doesn't look at the explosions, while thinking about what still remains to be done. Even though the leader of the Sarafan is now gone, the Order itself is still in charge of most of Nosgoth. There are Sarafan to defeat, cities to rebuild, and a new order to be built under the rule of Kain, quite neatly paving way for Blood Omen 3, which... oh, never mind then. Blood Omen 2 is not a masterpiece, but it's also not nearly as bad as some parts of the internet might lead you to believe. The story of the game I find absolutely fascinating, even if it does have its issues. For example, the storyline involving the Hilden I do like a lot, as it is finally tying together several things that were merely alluded to during Soul Reaver 2. First of all, we get a confirmation that the race seen in the murals is indeed called Hilden, and Janus gives us more details of the conflict between the vampires and the Hilden, and the circumstances of their banishment from Nosgoth. Having a confirmation to this and hearing how the realm to which they were banished is basically the same realm in which the demons seen in several games live in, explains by itself quite well why the Hilden might be a little bit annoyed at the vampires and any other species living in Nosgoth. The plan of the Sarafan Lord as well is developed bit by bit, and I like the way it was done. I enjoy this kind of storytelling where introduced elements change in meaning as the story progresses, such as the early industrial world of the current Nosgoth, with glyph magic being used like electricity is in the real world, and then recontextualizing that with a more nefarious purpose, which in this case was to act as a magical network through which the Hilden Doomsday Machine could spread its telepathic wave of mass destruction. We're also clued into a detail that is left partially unresolved, which I don't mind, as that is after all a theme in the entire series. You are given portions of a story which by itself is already quite a lot, but might get developed further in later installments of the series. In this case, that piece of information is that it's likely that the return of the Hilden was a part of the plan all along, and everything Kain was manipulated to do from the beginning of Blood Omen was orchestrated with this goal in mind. Perhaps even explaining the difference in motivation that Mortanius seemed to have before and after transforming into a demonic being at the end of the game. There are parts of the story which are not told quite as well though, and the main one is likely the kinda sorta romance plot built around Kain and Uma. It really comes out of the blue and feels very forced, since the relationship between the two has been somewhat combative for the entire duration of the game, and only at the very end does the game properly express that Kain had any feelings toward her aside from being a useful ally. Another portion where I do think the writers did drop the ball though was the new history of Kain. Not because the idea of his crusade and his old vampire lieutenants having betrayed not only him, but the entire vampire species in favor of promises of survival is bad, because I think that's actually a pretty good potential story, but because it wasn't developed as well as it perhaps should have been. For instance, the introduction video has no narration, and we are left to interpret those visuals ourselves. I'm assuming the idea here was to give us glimpses of Kain's past and keep us in a similar state as Kain is at the start of the game, knowing only glimpses of his past. This, however, in my opinion, does not really work. Instead, I would have preferred the introduction to take more pointers from Soul Reaver, for example, which quite effectively combined narration and striking visuals to explain important portions of the backstory in an abbreviated way to immediately give the player a slight familiarity with the characters involved with the story. Not only that, in Soul Reaver, every single vampire lieutenant gained more backstory whenever you reached their territory, with a narration from Raziel explaining more details about the features of the brother whom he is at that point hunting, and the relationship that vampire had within the structure that was Kain's empire. All of this is basically missing from Blood Omen 2, and there is barely any emotional connection to the new characters. Even if the vampire traitors are indeed that, traitors to vampires and Kain, the way their story is told leaves so much unsaid and tries to get to the end with such speed that there's little to no connection made between the player and the characters, which to me is a massive shame, since there was so much potential in the story of Kain and his old lieutenants. Kain's amnesia as well seems barely developed and is practically forgotten halfway through the game. All in all, they could have just cut that plot completely from the game, and it would have likely just made it better. Thankfully, the storytelling of the main plot is significantly better, and there is another portion which I also appreciate quite a lot. That is the world of Nosgoth itself. We are not told much of the current Nosgoth directly, since the state of the world is practically irrelevant to the main story. But we can learn a lot about the world from the environment and NPC banter. The world itself has developed significantly ever since Blood Omen when it comes to technology. There are glyph-powered vehicles and many other mechanical devices which give the world a very early industrial look. There are also many medieval-looking remnants, especially in the city, giving the world a look where everything old has been preserved and merely converted to take advantage of the new technologies that were developed. When we finally get outside of the city walls, there is barely any nature or wildlife, because the corruption of the pillars is already slowly killing the world, as the wilderness through which Kain has to travel is slowly beginning to show signs of the apocalyptic wasteland seen in Soul Reaver. This kind of storytelling I've always found fascinating, and I'm so glad that clearly a lot of thought was put into how the world would be at this point in the timeline. Controls of the game are at the same time pretty good and quite strange. As mentioned earlier, Kain controls in a way that is best described as tank controls, which to me is a strange decision for this kind of a game. The controls work well for what they are, but the style isn't really as suited to this kind of a game as the control style for Soul Reaver is, for example. Thankfully, there isn't that much precision platforming in the game, so at the very least, most of the game was decently designed around the chosen control scheme. Combat, on the other hand, begins as an interesting system, combining blocking, trying to time your dodges and attacks, and for a while it's actually a pretty fun system. Unfortunately, this changes completely towards the end of the game. The functions of the combat system do not change, but instead it has the same issues as the combat system of Soul River 2. Instead of changing how the fights work and adding more features little by little to keep up the variety of combat, the enemies just get better and faster. At the end, this means that it's almost impossible to get any regular attacks through the enemy's defenses, even if you manage to do a perfect dodge and begin attacking before the enemy has finished their power attack. Instead, they just immediately snap to face you and enter blocking mode. This means that in the later chapters, the most likely way fights will go is this. You block until your focus bar is full, then you use the Immolate ability, which insta-kills the enemy. As you can imagine, this is not particularly interesting and transforms fighting from a somewhat interesting system to a waiting game. It does not help that the final battle of the game ends up being basically the same. All other boss fights take advantage of the environment and have you use your abilities in combination with that environment to be able to defeat your opponent. With the final battle, however, this only applies to the first phase, and the rest is just block, block, dodge, usability, repeat. After several chapters of doing exactly that for every encounter, it is a massive shame that the final battle follows the same pattern. The final battle also shows another feature that I'm sure everyone is happy that I will be complaining about. Again, the aspect ratio strangeness is even worse in Blood Omen 2 than it has been in the previous games. Considering the discussions had after the release of the last video, I think it's a good idea to explain why I take umbrage at the aspect ratio stuff in video games in more detail. Back in the day, 4:3 was a common aspect ratio for TVs and computer monitors. Movies, however, were not filmed in this aspect ratio, so when shown on television, they had to choose between two options. Either they had to crop the video to fit in a 4:3 box, or they had to show the entire filmed area and deal with the fact that this shrinks the video and has parts of the television screen be black, or letterboxed. On television, however, another dilemma became an issue when widescreen televisions were becoming more common, as most shows were filmed in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Either the shows could be shown as is, which caused pillar boxing, or black borders on the sides of the image, or the image of the show had to be cropped and the remaining image stretched to fit the widescreen aspect ratio. These were common dilemmas and completely understandable for filmed media. After all, you can't just take a camera and film more footage to fill the sides of the show if you want to transform a 4:3 show into a widescreen format. With video games, however, this is not an issue, as the rendering of the scene is already done in real time and usually in a 3D environment that doesn't have clearly defined visible edges of nothingness, and you can just add more to whichever side of the image to fit the game into the size and shape of the screen you're playing in. This is not what the Legacy of Kain games do, however. But instead they opt for the same solution that was sometimes taken when converting a TV show into widescreen format. Instead of showing more, they crop the image and show you less. I do not like this one bit. And once more, the game doesn't even have subtitles to justify the inclusion of a completely black bar in a 4:3 display. Not only that, this to me is off-putting because the mixing and matching of different aspect ratios makes it absolutely clear you're playing a video game. This might sound like a silly criticism since it is a video game, but I also like to try and immerse myself in a game. And when I see suddenly spawning black bars, it just immediately takes me off that immersion. Now, why does the final battle bring this into mind? Because Blood Omen 2 mixes and matches aspect ratios more than any other Legacy of Kain game, as the main game runs in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Then pre-rendered cutscenes run in a 16:9 aspect ratio, whereas the in-game cutscenes run in a 16:10 aspect ratio. That's 3 different aspect ratios that you gotta see within just minutes of gameplay, and it's an absolutely flabbergastingly silly choice to me. And as said in the previous videos, this style of widescreen conversion in a video game means that the game is window boxed whenever you're playing full screen, and large portions of the screen on all sides of the displayed game is just a black void of nothingness. I don't find this a good choice at all. This, I hope, explains a little bit why I dislike this trope of the games at the turn of the millennium. Yes, it's still used to this day, but far less than it used to be. And I still dislike it. There's no need for games to try and emulate a medium which used these systems because there were no other good options, when games do have those better options available due to the nature of how the visual aspects of the games are displayed. Anyway, that is it for my mandatory aspect ratio rant. Overall though, despite a rather long list of complaints, the game is not that bad. The controls feel a bit weird, but they are not difficult to adjust to. And the maps have, for the most part, been designed to take these controls into account. The game is extremely linear and doesn't try to hide it like Soul Reaver 2 did, but that linear nature works within the storytelling style of the game, as you have to experience the world in a specific order, slowly seeing exactly the things that the developers wanted you to see. It could feel like a constraint, and I understand that view, but in this instance I do think it works rather well. The varying landscapes and vistas you see during your travels through the industrial Nosgoth as well I do really enjoy, and each area gives you a glimpse into this new world built for the game, bit by bit developing its character as you and Kain both become more familiar with this new age. Most of the boss battles are enjoyable enough, even if still rather simple. But this has been the case for the entire series, so using it as a complaint for this game specifically would feel unfair. At least unlike Soul Reaver 2, this game does have those puzzle-style boss battles again. The ability system as well I do like, even if it is basically a copy of the system in Soul Reaver. But when something works, why not use it? In Blood Omen 2, those abilities are rather well used in environmental exploration and puzzle solving as well, even if many of the puzzles are still rather simplistic. There are some aspects I do wish they had taken more advantage of, such as the alarm system, which was shown in an early area of the game, but basically completely forgotten for the rest of it. So, in the end, would I recommend playing the game? Not necessarily as much as I would recommend playing the other games in the series, but still, yes. Yes, I would. The game is occasionally janky and the obvious linearity might not add to the immersion of the game, but it's not that bad. And that's the key point, I guess. Blood Omen 2 is not great, but it's not that bad. It's extremely average. If all you want the story, sure, watch a YouTube video, since the game is also longer than Soul Reaver. But in my opinion, it's still worth experiencing, if for no other reason than to see how mediocrity manifests itself. And despite that mediocrity, I would have liked to see a Blood Omen 3, since the storylines that this game teases could have been very interesting to see. But that is it for this time, and I would like to thank all of the Ko-fi and Patreon supporters, High Food Court, Iliad Drone, Paul Leone, The Bloke, Zai, and Daniel Zupke. Thank you for your patience and continued support. It's been humbling that so many people have found these videos, and that the reaction to them has been mostly positive, and that some of you have gone above and beyond supporting this project. Never did I imagine that my little videos would be seen by so many people when I began with the Ultima series. Once more, my heartfelt thank you to you all. Next time, we'll get into the final chapter of the Legacy of Kain saga, closing yet another chapter in this channel's history as we see where the story of Kain and Raziel finally ends. But until then, Vintrovert signing out.